The Redemptorists were founded by St. Alphonsus, and the catch cry was that we preached the good news to the most abandoned, and that's what we, theoretically, is what we do. So we try to do that. Not everybody's able to go out into distant places. Many work in cities, but the idea is to reach out either in the cities to the drug addicts, to the sick, to the unchurched, and up in the more remote areas is to reach out to people on cattle stations who are very remote and abandoned, and the people in the towns who are bedevilled by drugs, alcohol, domestic violence, that kind of work. I belong, strangely, to the North Perth community, and we had a kind of catchphrase that we had two apostolates. One was home and one was away, based on the TV program Home and Away, and I'm the person who's now doing the away bit, away to the extent of being 1,600 kilometres from Perth. So my superior at the time, Ed Nixon, was very keen that I come up here and work in this parish, in this area. I think it's an outreach to people who tend to be neglected. I think that's why I've been asked to come up here. Well, I guess I was born in the bush in South Australia, in the outback. But where have I been? I spent 5 years in outback regions in Australia, from Geraldton up to Port Hedland, Port Pirie, the whole of the Diocese of Port Pirie, then Townsville out to the Territory border, and Cairns up to the Torres Strait Islands. So I covered a lot of bush areas there. Well, in general, it's quite isolated. In many cases, the neighbour is 50 to 100 kilometres away, and it's pretty isolated, and there may be 200-300 kilometres out of town. So that's one element that's pretty important and much part of life in the bush. Raising a family is difficult because you haven't got any neighbours, kids to play with. The schooling is done through School of the Air, or very often with the mother being the teacher. So there are some of the things. And it's kind of fairly hard. It's a struggle against adversity, droughts and bushfires and things like that. And it's tough for Dad and Mum and the kids. Well, my experience of work in Australia has been that I don't call it mission. The man that I work with, David Hoare, and I worked for 5 years in the outback, remote areas, which we deliberately chose, and we called it renewal programs. We would go into an area and we'd work there for 3 weeks, having gatherings or visiting the families. So that was the mission, and we spoke of the fairly basic things of the good news, that people's great value in themselves, of great importance to God, that kind of thing. So that was basically the message that we tried to give the people. And we also gave them an experience of being together as church centred, hopefully around the Eucharist. I think when people in remote areas gather for the Eucharist, for example, it's a trip of 50 or 100 kilometres to get there, and when they do, they nearly always will have a cup of coffee, have a meal, have a barbecue, and that gathering for social things is part of the Christian message, I think. So also their care for one another, their support for one another is very notable. So that's a thing that I think they care for one another, regardless of religion or regardless of whatever denomination they may be. They'll reach out and help somebody. Somebody's sick, they'll rally around and really help one another. And I think that's a very spiritual good thing, as well as being good fun. Well, you get an experience of people's struggles to survive on the land. You have their struggle to preserve their faith, to bring up their kids in the Catholic faith, and a heroism with which they do that, to raise their kids, one, as human beings, and two, as Christians. It's marvellous what they'll do, the extent to which they'll go. And what happens is, after primary school, very often the school of the air goes up to the end of primary school, many Catholics will send their children to the city, to boarding schools, which are very expensive, but they're prepared to do that to give their kids a good education, and a good Catholic education. I suppose our history as a group of missioners is based on Alphonsus' move, who moved out of the great city of Naples over the mountains into very remote areas. He reached out to people on the margins, the very poor, the uneducated, those who have been drifted away from the church, and he worked with them, and we tend to try and do that. We've always done it everywhere to try and get people back into the church. But now I think I personally like to work just with human beings who are in remote and difficult circumstances.